Atenția lumii este concentrată asupra războiului din Ucraina, dar vechiul conflict israeliano-palestinian continuă să se deruleze cu agresivitate crescută. În Israel s-au intensificat atacurile asupra civililor. De partea cealaltă, palestinienii spun că Israel își extinde coloniile și că ocupă și mai mult din teritoriile lor. Lucrul acesta reduce șansele și așa fragile ca soluția celor două state să fie vreodată pusă în practică. Discutăm situația din teren cu Amal Jadou, viceministrul palestinian pentru afaceri externe. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. Amal Jadou, Palestinian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you very much for receiving me.
Negev Summit este numele celei mai recente întâlniri care a avut loc în Israel între ministrul de externe al gazdelor și omologii lui din SUA și câteva state arabe. Acest gen de întruniri nu mai miră pe nimeni după semnarea acordurilor Abraham, tratatele care ajută la dezvoltarea relațiilor economice dintre anumite țări arabe și Israel. Chiar dacă subiectul summitului a fost Iran și implicațiile pe care le poate avea semnarea unui nou acord nuclear, problema palestiniană a fost și ea în atenția liderilor.
The Arab countries, Egypt and United States, met in Israel recently for the Negev Summit, which was dedicated to Iran. How was this meeting seen from the Palestinian side?
What is very important to us is that Secretary Blinken visited Ramallah, one day before the summit, and the King of Jordan was in Ramallah on the same day of the summit. And this is very much, important for us as an indication that no matter what the issues in the region are, the Palestinian question remains a very important issue for the international and regional partners. This is very important that Secretary Blinken visited and reiterated the positions adopted by the administration in Washington in their commitment to the two-state solution, their intolerance of forced eviction for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, their negation to the expansionist policy of settlements that the Israeli government advocates for and actually practices on the ground. So this was a very important message on the importance and the centrality of the Palestinian issue for all the guests who basically, the more important guests who were, in the region.
Egypt and Morocco are both supporters of the Palestinian issues, and more than that, Morocco is also protecting the Islam holy sites, including Jerusalem. How are the links of those two countries with Israel helping the Palestinian cause?
Palestine for Egypt is not only an importance of brotherly relations and all of that, but it's a national security issue for Egypt. It has been and it continues to be, and basically we enjoy very good relations with Egypt, and Egypt is the party that is involved in the reconciliation talks between the Palestinians, the different political parties, and they have played a very decisive role throughout the war and also the political process. The Egyptian blood is mixed with the Palestinian blood. Morocco is another brotherly country, and basically, yes, the king, His Majesty the King of Morocco is the head of the Al-Quds Fund, basically since '75, and the Moroccans have been supportive of the Palestinians in international arenas. When it comes also to the religious places, the Jordanian monarch also has, the custodianship over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that's also part of the reason why the king has visited the state of Palestine just recently, because there are indications because of Israeli, extremist parties who want basically to enter the vicinity of the mosque and desecrate it during the month of Ramadan. It's very important, the involvement of all of our partners. I mean, we enjoy good relations with all of our brothers, and it's within the Arab League, and we believe that the commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative is very important, which really calls for ending the Israeli occupation of Arab territories, not only Palestinian territories, as a way to normalize and enhance relations in the region towards stability in general.
Guvernul de coaliție condus de Naftali Bennett nu este interesat de relansarea procesului de pace israeliano-palestinian. Coordonatorul special al Națiunilor Unite pentru procesul de pace din Orientul Mijlociu a avertizat Consiliul de Securitate că extinderea coloniilor actuale pe care israelienii le-au în Cisjordania alimentează violența. Și într-adevăr, atacurile dintre cele două popoare s-au întețit în ultima vreme, de o parte și alta a zidului care le desparte. În teritoriile palestiniene, orașul Jenin din nordul Cisjordaniei este un fel de punct zero al rezistenței împotriva israelienilor.
Well, Israel has a coalition government, and this government said very clear that they are in charge of short-term issues. Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very complicated one, so it's not in their, let's say, range of preoccupation. How do you see this? Do you want to restart the peace talks with the Israelis?
We're very much committed to a peace process and to the parameters and the principles that are adopted by the international community as the parameters to the solution. However, I want to go back to the question. The assumption is not right, because while this government says that it doesn't want to occupy itself with the conflict, in fact it is entangling itself and us in a deepening of the conflict through its policy of settlement expansion, de facto.
They managed to build any settlements?
They are building.
They are in power?
They're building hugely. They're expanding. I mean, not new settlements, but expanding the settlements, building new roads, tunnels, designating areas as green areas, and these are all Palestinian territory. Designating areas as closed military areas, and if you match the plans that the Israeli government has been adhering to, you find the annexation plan, the famous annexation plan that Prime Minister Netanyahu was talking about in 2020. So basically, in reality, what we see is a de facto annexation of the Palestinian territory. So while Prime Minister Bennett says no to negotiations, and no to the two-state solution, and no to meeting with Palestinian leaders, and yes to the extension of to expanding of settlements. In fact, they're changing the reality on the ground, making any future negotiations even much more difficult. Today, we have 700,000, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers in the occupied territory of the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. That's a huge number of people. If you remember, when when the Israelis tried to do the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, there were only 9,000 Israeli settlers in Gaza, and they made a huge, case out of it. Imagine what it will take to evacuate 700,000 Israeli settlers. And today, settlers are basically becoming more and more violent. There are attacks that are recorded by the international community. So the reality on the ground is a status of apartheid. There are two sets of law that apply to one territory of land. One Israeli law for the settlers, and one is the occupation law that applies on the Palestinians. There are roads that are dug mainly for the use of the settlers, and roads that are dug for Palestinians' use. There are tunnels that are basically planned in order to connect the settlements with each other, but also with Israel proper. So the reality is a reality of apartheid.
Well, since we are talking about realities, and you did mention a couple of no's coming from the Israeli side, one other reality on the ground is the fact that maybe no is the final solution to the conflict between the Palestinians and Israeli. And we noticed that some of the young Arab living in the region are fighting for more rights, for instance. On the other hand, we have people like those in Jenin fighting, literally fighting with the Israelis. What do you think is the best solution if let's say, the worst case scenario, no means no in the end?
The whole invention of the two-state solution was not a Palestinian invention. It was actually a European invention that we adhered to, we accepted in 1988. We accepted the two-state solution, and we have been working towards that solution together with the international community. Obviously, Israel not only says no to the two-state solution, but it also says no to a binational state. But the reality on the ground, what we see on the ground, is a reality of an apartheid. We want to have our own state with our own flag, living our own aspirations as a nation, but what Israel is doing on the ground is basically moving us away from that solution. We're surrounded by soldiers and settlers. The only Israelis that Palestinians see are soldiers and settlers. And this is not a reality for any people to live under. And our hope is basically to have our independent state, but the reality on the ground is not determined by us, and the world is silent.
But then again, Israel says and see as well that they are attacked.
Israel is attacked because the Israelis are in the Palestinian cities as occupiers, not as visitors, not as guests. We're very warm with our guests, as you know, you visited Palestine. But the Israelis are in the occupied territories as occupiers, as an occupying nation. And basically, they violate Palestinians' rights, extrajudicial killing. We have 4,500 Palestinians who are in Israeli jails. Around 500 of them are there under administrative detention. There are checkpoints, there are controls. There is a power that is trying, or that is taking control of your life. So basically, you cannot expect, Palestinians basically to just, embrace them. Obviously, our line, the leadership's line, is basically we stand against occupation using diplomatic, legal, and political means. But the Israelis, even to that, the president extends his hands to the Israelis, and the Israeli prime minister says no to the two-state solution, no to negotiations with the Palestinians. So basically, by doing just that, they empower the more extreme elements in the Palestinian society to capitalize on basically the lack and the vacuum and the lack of any political process forward. I believe that if we really want to encourage the ethos of peace and the ethos of acceptance, we need to have a horizon and a political process that will lead everyone in the direction of peace between the two peoples.
Palestinienii au avut recent alegeri locale. Organizația Hamas nu a permis derularea alegerilor în fâșia Gaza pe care o conduce. Membrii Hamas s-au candidat însă la alegerile organizate în Cisjordania, într-o coaliție cu Fondul Popular pentru Eliberarea Palestinei, cea mai activă mișcare de stânga din societatea palestiniană. Problema nu este reprezentată de diversitatea partidelor politice, ci de ideologia lor, pentru că Hamas alege calea armelor, în timp ce conducerea tradițională din Cisjordania este pentru diplomație.
Speaking of more extremist elements in the Palestinian society, we see that now in West Bank, Hamas did a sort of alliance with the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine and won some of the towns in elections, municipalities. Is this a switch of power?
For us, Hamas is a Palestinian political party. It's not a monolithic movement like any other political movement all over the world.
And for Israel, it's a terrorist organization, as you well know.
Israel can designate, they've designated 6 human rights organizations in Palestine as terrorist organizations. This is an occupying power. They can basically designate, anything that they want as a terrorist organization. Hamas has a representation in the Palestinian society, and it hasn't changed tremendously. It hasn't become bigger. Hamas did not allow for those elections to take place in Gaza, but they participated in the elections in the West Bank, and they did align themselves with different political parties.
But as you said earlier, Fatah and the PLO is supporting diplomatic approach and political approach toward the solution,
True.
While Hamas is supporting more, let's say, the armed solution to find a sort of end of negotiations. So
basically, the solution is to allow for elections. I mean, there is a division, there is, disagreement on the approach.
Yeah, but it's a disagreement on the premises, on the
Exactly. But the thing is that, I mean, we're trying to deal with the reaction to the actual act. The main problem is with the fact that we have occupation. I mean, the problem lies with the fact that we have occupation. Now we're trying to look at, how others deal with the occupation instead of actually focusing our attention on the reality of the fact that Palestine is occupied and the world has a responsibility, by abiding to international law to ending that occupation. The PLO adopted the two-state solution as a way out, and like in any other conflict in the region and elsewhere, there are different approaches to dealing with that conflict. Obviously, the predominant approach is the political, diplomatic approach. There are others that believe differently, and I think that if we empower the diplomatic approach, if we empower the political process, if the Israelis respond positively to engaging in a political process, if we empower the horizon of a two-state solution, then we weaken others who think differently.
The international community, especially Europe and the US, are busy right now. Their political attention is focused mainly on the conflict in Ukraine. How is this going to affect the finding a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is a very long, very old conflict,
protracted,
and maybe right now is not important comparing with what's near us?
The fact that we have a conflict, in Europe today should not also detract the attention from attaining a solution to the Palestinian question, exactly because of what you said. The more time passes, the conflict becomes more entrenched, and the reality on the ground, people tend to think that there is a status quo. Yes, there is a status quo on the action of us and the international community, Palestinians, but Israel continues with changing the reality on the ground, day by day, minute by minute, second by second, with its policy of settlement and expansion. And I believe that if the trend continues with the same rhythm, we will find ourselves talking about, only, a shadow of a two-state solution, because the reality is really changing. But going back to basically dealing with the conflict, I believe that in each conflict we need to abide by international law. We need to abide by the Charter of the United Nations, and we need basically to allow for peoples everywhere in the world to live their right to self-determination. This is what we have been asking for. This is what we have been asking the international community to implement, and basically, hopefully, this will also resonate as basically the international players, adhere or basically try to deal with the Palestinian issue. That's why I'm here in Bucharest, to meet my counterparts and to engage with them on the reality on the ground. Stability in our region is important to the stability in Europe. We're in your backyard. We're very much connected, and basically also contributing to a solution in the core of the Middle East, conflict, the Palestine-Israeli conflict, will contribute also to stability in general in the region. Going back to the first question, Egypt went to having peace with Israel in '79. Jordan had an agreement with Israel in '94, and then the Abrahamic Accords are only recent. But the main, conflict is between the Palestinians and the Israelis. At the core of the conflict is the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's our territory that is occupied. We have had the conflict for ages, with the Israelis, and we're not going to go away. If Israel has peace with all the Arab countries, the Palestinian issue will remain as an issue that needs a solution.
In a recent summit in NATO, President Biden said that the entire world should expect a crisis when it comes to food. This is an effect we already witness in Europe. What is expected in Palestine?
Well, it's a global issue, and like the pandemic was a global issue where we were affected by it, also, the conflict here will have its impact on us, especially that Palestine depends a lot on buying wheat and flour from Russia and Ukraine. They're our two main partners when it comes to this commodity, and also sunflower oil. We depend on Ukraine. The government is trying its best best to shelter the citizens right now because we enter into the month of Ramadan. But I think that we will be impacted like any other nation, and I'm sure our Ministry of Economy and our business people will be trying to look for other sources in order to supplement the needs that Palestinians will have in these two commodities.
Amal Jadou, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Palestine, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you very much. Thank you for receiving me.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!